May 5th, 2021, Weymouth, Massachusetts. A modest home on a quiet street, hospice nurses moving softly through the rooms. George Jakob Jung, 78 years old, was dying of liver and kidney failure. The man who once moved 85% of the cocaine entering America in the early 1980s. The man Johnny Depp turned into a Hollywood anti-hero. Boston George, El Americano. He was alone. No private jets, no suitcases full of cash, no Colombian bodyguards. Just a hospital bed and the long, slow arithmetic of consequences. But this story isn't about him. Not really. This is about the woman who stood next to him when the money was rolling in by the trash bag. The woman the world only thinks it knows because Penelope Cruz played her on screen. Her name is Mirtha Calderon Jung, born December 3rd, 1952, in Cuba. She was 24 years old when she met George. She was a young Cuban woman with dark eyes and a sharp tongue, looking for adventure in a world that had already taught her how to survive. By 25, she was married to one of the most prolific cocaine smugglers on the planet. By 28, she was a mother. By 30, she was a federal inmate. This is the real story of the wife from Blow. The parts the movie left out. The Cuban girl who walked into the Medellin pipeline, got buried under it, and somehow walked back out alive. Here's what the film didn't tell you. Mirtha wasn't a passenger in George Jung's empire. She was inside it. And when it collapsed, she had to claw her way back to a normal life, with a baby on her hip and a federal record on her back. The question this story answers is the one the movie was too afraid to ask. What happens to the woman after the cocaine cowboy rides off? To understand Mirtha, you have to understand the world she walked into. Rewind to 1974. George Jung is sitting in a federal cell at the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut. He's doing time for moving 660 pounds of marijuana through Chicago. A bust at the Playboy Club. A snitch with a heroin charge looking to trade up. Classic story. But Danbury is where the universe rearranges itself for George, because his cellmate is a young Colombian German named Carlos Leder, 25 years old, wiry, restless, obsessed with airplanes. The two men spend nights talking about logistics, drop zones, refueling points. Leder tells George about a white powder that nobody in America is moving in volume yet. A powder that sells for 80 times what they pay for it in the jungles outside Medellin. They make a pact. When they get out, they're going to build something nobody has ever seen. They get out in 1975, and they do exactly that. By 1976, George Jung is flying small aircraft out of Colombia, refueling in the Bahamas, landing on dirt strips in Southern California. The money comes in faster than they can launder it. $250,000 a month had been his marijuana peak. Now he's pulling in millions in weeks. And somewhere in that whirlwind, in a Colombian house full of pilots, gunmen, and emissaries from the Medellin pipeline, George Jung meets a Cuban girl named Mirtha Calderon. She wasn't a kingpin's daughter. She wasn't a courier. She was a young woman from a displaced Cuban family who had drifted into the orbit of men with money and danger written on them. The accounts of how they met vary. Some say she was introduced through a mutual Colombian friend. Some say she walked into a party in Medellin, and George couldn't look away. What's documented is this. She was 10 years younger than him. She was magnetic. And George, for all his criminal arrogance, fell hard. They married in 1977. You have to picture what that marriage looked like. It wasn't a small wedding in a Boston church. It was a union forged in the eye of a hurricane. George was running cocaine into Cape Cod airstrips, Norman's Cay, southern Florida. Carlos Leder was building his transit base in the Bahamas. The cash was being stuffed into duffel bags, into closets, into safety deposit boxes from Miami to Antigua. And Mirtha was right there, inside it, living it. Here's the thing most documentaries get wrong. Mirtha wasn't naive. She wasn't a girl who didn't know what her husband did for a living. She knew. She handled money. She traveled with him. She lived in the houses cocaine bought, Reports indicate she was, in her own words later, instrumental in some of the operations during those years. She wasn't pulling triggers. She wasn't piloting planes. But she was woven into the daily mechanics of a smuggling empire that was rewriting the American drug map. And then in 1978, on August 1st, everything that mattered to her changed shape. Christina Sunshine Jung was born. Picture that moment. A young Cuban mother, a baby girl, a husband who couldn't be reached half the time because he was in a hangar in Colombia or a hotel room in Miami counting bricks of currency. The name itself tells you something about who Mirtha and George were trying to be. Christina, after George's father. Sunshine, after Florida, where she was born. A pretty name for a child being raised in the eye of a federal storm. For a moment, Mirtha tried to play house. They had homes. They had cars. They had cash. They threw parties. They flew first class. By 1979, George was estimated to be moving cocaine in volumes that, in his own retelling, made him $100 million. The number is disputed. Court records and historians later flagged a lot of his self-mythology as exaggerated. What isn't disputed is that the household income, on paper invisible, was the kind of money you only see in a federal indictment. But cocaine doesn't stay in the dealer's safe. It gets into the dealer's house, into the dealer's bloodstream, into the dealer's marriage. Mirtha started using. The reports are clear on this. She became addicted to the very product her husband was flooding the country with. And the marriage that had started in heat and money started rotting from the inside. There were fights. There were absences. There were nights when Christina was a toddler in a house full of strangers and powder. George later admitted in interviews that he was a terrible father during those years. Mirtha would later admit she was a terrible mother during them. 2 addicts, 1 baby. A growing federal target on their backs. This is the part the movie softens. The real Mirtha wasn't just the fiery wife throwing tantrums in a Miami restaurant. She was a young Cuban woman drowning in cocaine, while her husband chased 1 more score. The first sign that the empire was crumbling came in 1980. Carlos later, by then operating his own kingdom on Norman's Cay in the Bahamas, was becoming reckless. The DEA was watching. The Bahamian government was watching. The Medellin pipeline was being mapped by intelligence agencies across 2 hemispheres. George Jung, the American front of the operation, was a name on every federal whiteboard. And in the early 1980s, the trap closed on Mirtha. She was arrested on drug charges. The exact circumstances have been told different ways in different interviews, but the documented outcome is consistent. She went to federal prison. She served approximately 3 years. She walked into a federal facility as a 20-something Cuban-American mother and walked out as something else entirely. Here's where the story turns. Because most people, when they hit federal time, come out worse, angrier, harder, more entangled in the life. Mirtha did the opposite. Prison, for her, became the place she got sober, the place she stopped, the place she looked at her daughter's face in a visiting room and made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She was done. With cocaine, with George, with the whole gleaming, deadly machine. When she was released around 1981, by some accounts, she walked out clean and stayed clean. And when George kept spinning further into the chaos, when he refused to give up the life that had already cost them everything, Mirtha did something that takes a particular kind of courage. She left him. The divorce was finalized in 1984. 7 years of marriage, 1 daughter, a federal record on each of them. A trail of busted shipments and burned associates stretching from the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta to the back roads of Cape Cod. Mirtha took Christina and walked out of the cocaine cowboy era with the only thing that mattered, her child. Now here's where you have to understand something about the geography of betrayal in this story. While Mirtha was rebuilding, George was sinking. He kept smuggling. He kept getting busted. Smaller stuff. Sloppier work. The Medellin connection had dried up. Carlos later was captured in Colombia in 1987, extradited to the United States, and would eventually be sentenced to life plus 135 years. Pablo Escobar, the cartel's untouchable patron, would be killed on a Medellin rooftop in 1993. The world that had made George Jung was disintegrating around him. And on a highway in Topeka, Kansas, in 1994, federal agents pulled him over with 1,754 pounds of cocaine, 3 counts of conspiracy, 60 years in federal prison. Mirtha was already long gone by then. She was raising a teenage daughter. She was trying to figure out how to be a mother in a country that had a file on her. She was also, importantly, watching the man she had once loved be sentenced to die in a cage, while she had been given something he never got, a second chance she had actually used. This is the part of the story that almost nobody tells you. The years between 1985 and the present, the quiet decades. The decades that don't make a Hollywood movie because there are no chase scenes and no piles of cash on hotel beds. In those years, Mirtha did the hardest work a person who has been inside the drug trade can do. She got ordinary. She avoided publicity. She raised Christina in the United States, away from the cocaine cowboy mythology that started to surround her ex-husband once the book Blow by Bruce Porter was published in 1993. When the movie came out in 2001, with Penelope Cruz playing her on screen, Mirtha did not capitalize. She did not do the talk show circuit. She did not write a tell-all. She stayed quiet. And Christina grew up. She became an entrepreneur and an actress. She eventually reconciled with her father in his final years. There's a photograph George once posted on social media, his daughter beside him, with the caption that he couldn't live without his heart. By the time of that photograph, Mirtha had been clean for decades. You have to understand what that takes. To be the wife of one of the most famous drug smugglers in American history, to have served federal time, to have lost a marriage, a fortune, a decade, and then to choose, every single day, to walk in the opposite direction of the life that defined you. She lives in the United States now, privately. She does not maintain public social media accounts. She rarely gives interviews. Reports suggest she turned toward writing and personal reflection in her later years. She is in her early 70s, a grandmother, a survivor of a chapter of American history that swallowed almost everyone who touched it. Now here's what makes Mirtha's story matter. Not the love affair, not the cocaine, not the Penelope Cruz performance. The thing that matters is the math. Look at the body count of the people George Jung worked with. Carlos Lader, life in federal prison. Pablo Escobar, dead in a hail of bullets in 1993. Countless mid-level smugglers, dead or in cages. George Jung himself, 20 years in federal prison. Broken health, dying in hospice in 2021. The Medellin cartel itself, dismantled, scattered, replaced by even more brutal successors in Cali and beyond. And Mirtha Calderon Jung is alive, free, sober, a mother, a grandmother, a private citizen. How? That's the question this whole story is really asking. How did the wife survive when almost everyone else didn't? The answer is the part that's hardest to put on a movie poster. She got out early. She paid the price early. She used prison as a door instead of a wall. And the moment she had a clean record and a clean bloodstream, she put as much distance as she could between herself and the man she had once stood next to in Colombian living rooms full of money and powder. George Jung once said in an interview that the worst thing he ever did wasn't getting into the cocaine business. It was bringing the people he loved into it. He said that with the regret of a man who had lost his wife and almost lost his daughter, by the time he died in 2021, he and Mirtha had been divorced for 37 years. He had remarried, briefly, to a woman named Rhonda Clay Spinello, which became public in 2016 after a parole violation. He was alone at the end. Mirtha was not. There's a scene in Blow that has stayed with audiences for over 2 decades now. George visits a federal prison in a fantasy sequence, and his grown daughter doesn't come. He sits in the visiting room alone. The music swells. The credits roll. It's heartbreaking. It's cinematic. And in real life, the ending was both more painful and more redemptive. Christina did reconcile with her father. Mirtha did not. What does this story reveal about organized crime that the gangster movies keep getting wrong? It's this. The men in the photographs, the men with the planes and the guns and the briefcases, they are not the only ones paying the price. Behind every Boston George, there is a Mirtha Calderon. Behind every Carlos Lader, there is a wife and a child. Behind every kilo of cocaine that landed on a runway in southern Florida, there was a household that became a war zone. The cartel didn't just destroy the smugglers, it destroyed the rooms they slept in. Mirtha's redemption isn't a Hollywood ending. There's no scene where she walks into the sunset with a violin score. Her redemption is the unsexy, daily, grinding work of staying away. Staying sober, staying quiet, raising a child in the shadow of a name that became a brand, watching the man you once loved sentenced to 60 years in a federal cage while you cooked dinner in an ordinary American kitchen. That's a kind of survival the movies almost never depict, because it doesn't sell tickets, but it's the truest part of every cartel story ever told. The cocaine cowboy era ended a long time ago. The Medellin cartel is a museum exhibit. George Jung's ashes were scattered. Carlos Lader, after decades in federal custody, was deported to Germany in 2020. The names from the 1970s and 80s are footnotes now in a longer, uglier war that has only gotten worse. Mirtha Jung is still here. She is somewhere in the United States, in her 70s, living a life that almost no one knows the details of. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the woman who walked into the cocaine cowboy world at 24 and walked out at 32 understood something the men around her never did. That the only real win in that life is the one where nobody remembers your name. Mirtha Calderon Jung gave up the fortune. She gave up the lifestyle. She gave up the man. And in exchange, she got the one thing the cartel could never give her: time. Time with her daughter. Time with herself. Time to become someone who wasn't defined by the worst 7 years of her life. That's the real story of the wife from Blow. Not the screaming matches in Miami, not the cocaine on the glass tables, not the Penelope Cruz performance. The real story is the silence that came after. The decades of staying small and staying clean and staying alive. If George Jung is the cautionary tale of what cocaine does to the men who run it, Mirtha Jung is the rarer, quieter story. What it takes for someone to walk out of that world and never go back. Most of them never do. If you found this story compelling, hit subscribe. We drop a new deep dive every week. Tell us in the comments, who's the next forgotten figure from the cocaine era you want us to uncover?